Good morning, everybody who has been led to pay attention to this video. As you can see, I'm sitting here by the bay in Norfolk, Virginia. Nice calm day. I find being at the ocean to be very relaxing. And oftentimes when I'm here, I have a lot of revelation about life. My name is Christopher Brown. I'm 50 years old. And at this age, I am about to begin a new chapter in my life. And this new chapter requires me to do something out of my comfort zone, as well as be completely obedient as possible to the Word of God. And this chapter begins with me giving you guys, whoever's listening, my testimony, not to be judged or criticized or for hip hip hoorays and hurrahs, but simply to show the power of God when He puts His hands on a submissive person and turns their life around. Now, this testimony is going to be very open, very honest. It's going to make some of you think. This testimony is going to be very open, very honest, but it's going to be coming from my heart, and it's going to highlight the power of God in the end. I was born on a military base in Fulda, Germany. I'm the youngest of 5 children. I have 3 sisters and 1 brother, but unfortunately I was never very close to any of my siblings except for my youngest sister. And even today I still don't have really a lot of deep communications with 2 of my siblings. We grew up in a very strict household, of course. We had rules, we had regulations, you had to do your homework before you went outside, stuff like that. But even at a very early age, even though we went to church quite often, I had always had questions about spirituality, and what the Word of God said. But at the same time, I was always drawn to pastors and how they preached. I was drawn to how they delivered and drawn to how they were able to basically control the crowd, if I can use that word. I was not very much a popular kid. I'm all sweaty here because I just got done running. I was not a popular kid, and actually that would change when I got to high school. I wasn't very athletic either, but I managed to make friends with all the football players. And I managed to make these friends with all the football players because I became, at a very young age, a kid who could I became a thief. I would steal stuff from the stores, and I became very, very good at it. So much so that the football players would often give me a list of sweaters, jackets, jeans, whatever they wanted, and I would deliver, and they would give me a small fee, which to me back then was a lot of money. And then I hooked up with a good friend of mine back then, and he and I began to steal from the houses off base. Now, we had also gotten very good and lucrative at doing this, to the point that even my brother was paying us for stuff like VCRs and TVs. Well, as the years grew on, and I never was a guy who was into drugs. In fact, I was always terrified at the results of drugs. So I can say I've probably only smoked marijuana 3 times in my whole life. But I did enjoy a good drinking every now and then. One occasion, my friends who knew who my parents were, we got so drunk off, I don't know if any of y'all remember this drink called Mad Dog 2020. But I got so drunk that I passed out. And my friends were terrified, so they drugged me down to my house and laid me on the front porch. Well, long story short, I ended up in the hospital for alcohol poisoning. And my parents were nowhere near happy about that. I remember when I got out of the hospital a day later, I had a massive hangover. And my dad made me cut probably about a half an acre of grass with a push lawnmower. Let me say, that was a very difficult push. But yeah, life went on. So I entered into my senior year at high school, and now I enter into a new vice entered into my life. I ended up having, at the age of 17, my very first sexual encounter. Needless to say, the young lady became pregnant. Well, now throughout high school, I had a lot of female friends, but I never slept with them. I had a lot of female friends, but I never slept with them. So this was my very first encounter. And because of this birth, this led me to go through several meaningless jobs before I finally settled on joining the Navy. I joined the Navy in 1990, and my very first duty station was Newport, Rhode Island. Upon arriving in Newport, got us a place to stay. My career was going great. I was on that path of being, one of those notable sailors. I was taking courses. I was doing everything I needed to do to advance in my military career. Now, even though I was doing the right things, I still had issues. And the same two issues that I had started in high school. I still drank a lot. And I still had the company of a lot of women around me, even though I wasn't sleeping with them, because I somewhat had a few morals and characters. Well, as that duty station would go on, I would hook up with a group of guys, and the things that we did would pretty much ruin my career, as far as I consider it to be ruined. We drank constantly. We fought constantly. We just did everything an ungodly man would do. Well, my wife ended up coming to Newport, Rhode Island with my daughter, and our marriage had problems. Let me take a minute and go back to high school for a second. Before my future wife was pregnant with my daughter in high school, she had also gotten pregnant right before she got pregnant with my daughter from somebody else. She would abort that one, unfortunately, and I continued into the relationship, and about 1 month later, she got pregnant again. This time it was mine. And I tell you that part of the story for this reason. I won't say I was the greatest husband ever. Like I said, I was a heavy drinker, always had women around me. And so I could understand it might have given the perception that I was sleeping with them. So, during one of my 2-week-long deployments, I came home early and found out that she was having an affair with our neighbor. Well, that would lead me to just fly completely off the handle in an alcohol-induced rage. I spent that while she was at work. I spent the day, about 8 hours that day, plotting on how I was going to kill her. Like I said, this is going to be a very honest and truthful testimony. About an hour before she came home, I sent my daughter, who I think was like 2 at the time, to play with the neighbor's daughter, and I waited for her to come home. And once she came home, it was an unfortunate series of events, which led to me being arrested and being charged with assault, battery, assault with a deadly weapon, and intent to kill. Now, I said that my military career was off to a great start. Within those 2 years there, I had already picked up E5, but due to this event, I was now court-martialed. And that court-martial ended up putting me in jail for 3 months, busting me down from E5 to E2, forfeiture of half a month's pay for 3 months. So that put a serious hit in my career. But there was light at the end of the tunnel. The light was that I was allowed to continue on with my military career. Me and my wife would work it out, and we would end up getting pregnant again with my second daughter.
Time, 50 minutes.
Right about the time it was for her to deliver my second daughter, I took orders to a ship heading out of New Jersey, Earl, New Jersey. I left for Jersey, packed up the house, moved them down probably 2 weeks after my daughter was born, Shortly thereafter, I would depart on a 7-month Mediterranean cruise. As I mentioned before, me and my wife had this history of a very unloyal marriage. So this deployment just pretty much highlighted that fact. 2 months into this deployment, I get my sergeant, my command master chief, would call me into his office and tell me my house had been abandoned, and all these issues with my checking account were jacked up, and I couldn't figure out why. I thought my wife was home handling everything. If you know anything about the military, when you deploy, you turn over, you got to give your spouse full power of authority, full power of attorney to every aspect, all your finances and everything. So in essence, she acts on your behalf with no barriers. Well, when I come home, I found out that my ex-wife had taken my 2 daughters and moved in with another sailor to Alabama. Well, now I'm enraged again. I'm drinking heavily now, even more so. But this time I learned my lesson from the physical abuse. So this time I am going to get her back, and I'm going to show her, I'm going to take her through all the issues that she has taken me through. So I finally get a hold of her, I sweet talk her into coming back. She was kind of iffy, which understandable. And she moves in with one of my co-workers who lived across the street from me. But my 2 daughters moved back home with me. Well, eventually, she would move back in. And all the appearances of this relationship being fixed and okay are there, but I have an underlying motive. And my underlying motive is that I'm going to show her how it feels to be in an affair. I would take a job at a local hospital in New Jersey, and at this job I would meet this woman who happened to be about 30 years older than me, actually. Now, being that I had a part-time job, I needed a second car, because up until that point, we didn't need a car, but one. Now, this job, I worked in the emergency room, and everybody in the emergency room knew who my wife was. They knew who my 2 children were, because she would always come pick me up and drop me off. Well, I entered into this relationship with this new woman, and she even had a purpose, and that purpose was that I needed a new car. Now, as you can see, my relationship with my ex kind of shaped what my dementive thinking was of relationships now. Even though I came from a solid family background home in which my mom and dad never divorced until I never even argued, really, my definitions of relationships are now been changed to, I guess you can say everybody has a purpose. And once that purpose is taken care of, then, you dispose of it. Well, I entered into this relationship with this older woman, managed to talk her into buying me a car, and then once I had this car, I ended the relationship. But the thing was, I never hid this relationship from my wife, because I wanted to take her through some of the issues in which she took me through. But because this woman was 30 years older than me, that wasn't something that I was satisfied with. When you live apart from God, Satan is going to give you the tools to destroy yourself if you look hard enough. Well, one day, I walked into this hospital, as I've done about this time hundreds of times. Sitting at the front desk was this woman. Blonde hair, green-eyed, 5'9" Italian. And she had the nerve to say hi to me. Well, I walked over thinking I was Rico Suave, threw on some of my best lines, and we exchanged numbers, and our relationship flourished from there. Here's the thing, we both were actually married. She was actually going through a divorce at the same time, at the time, and I'm gonna soon be headed into a divorce. Within 2 weeks, I would enter into a relationship with this woman. And from that relationship, she would become pregnant. And of course, at the time of her pregnancy, I would be up for orders. It always seemed like I would get in the most trouble as my tour would come to an end. Well, I would take orders from New Jersey out to 29 Palms, California. But I'd already made my decision that there was no chance that I was going to stay married to my soon-to-be ex-wife and go to another spot in which I was going to deploy. So I would take her back home to Louisiana with my two daughters, and I would begin the process of entering into a very serious relationship with my newfound girlfriend. Well, she would get through her divorce, and she would also be pregnant with my son, and I'm still married and on active duty. Now, can you imagine the problems that's causing right now? Well, she would give birth to my son kind of secretly, and a few months after his birth, I would finally end up getting a divorce. All this occurred over the Memorial Day weekend, so I was already off work on that Monday. I would walk into paying disbursement with a divorce certificate from my ex-wife and a marriage license from my new wife and a birth certificate from my son. So again, let me remind you, this is just a straight from the heart, truthful testimony about the power of God. And I wanted to make sure I reiterated that because, as you can see, I talk with a lips too. That's why I hated being on camera. But I'm sure some of you already passed the judgment against me about what a freaking bum. Well, me and our marriage, she would give birth to my son in April. And would you know it, when she goes back for her 6 weeks checkup, she's already pregnant again. Now, the thing that I'm not too sure about with this marriage, is whether or not, based on the fact that we were both married, we entered into this marriage with kind of an unholy matrimony, was God's hand not in this marriage. Initially, this marriage started off fine, but soon all those old vices of mine began to show up. I would start drinking again. I was actually entered into a point where now I have this warped thinking of relationships. So I had this mindset that I am in control of the whole relationship. Everything has to go the way I say. It wasn't a physical abusive one, but it was definitely a mentally and verbally abusive relationship. Only towards the wife. Me and my kids have always been my best friends, I guess you can call it. Well, we would get out to California, but I would lie to the military and tell them I had a car accident. And that car accident, I would fake these. I was very good at being deceptive. I would fake all these documents because working in the emergency room, I stole I would be able to steal some kind of the police logbook, so I'd make copies of them, and I faked my own accident report. I would go on the computers using the doctor's passwords and faked an injury report. And due to the injuries, I would end up losing those orders, and they sent me to heal at a base in San Diego. Well, I would finally get divorced from my first wife, like I said earlier. I'm remarried now, and my third daughter, fourth child is born out in San Diego. But my relationship with my second wife is starting to deteriorate pretty quickly, due to my vices, I would say. Just being honest, I'm still a drinker, and now I am becoming more and more sexually immoral because I'm starting to enter into relationships with other women. Well, after school, I would get orders to a Marine Corps unit out of Camp Pendleton. Things seemed to be okay at the time. They're rocky, once you have an affair on somebody, you always have these moments of, you always have doubt. And I understand that. Now, I would deploy on my first deployment with this Marine Corps unit. Like I said, things seem to be okay. I come back, now I have a new issue. It's a ground combat unit. I end up developing PTSD to go along with my anger issues or my warped way of thinking. I become even more, I give up beer and now I become a heavy liquor drinker. My preferred is tequila and Jack Daniels. I'm always angry, I'm always breaking things, I'm always throwing things. My house was pretty much a house of fear for everybody but me. 18 months after returning home, I would be leaving out, 1 year after returning home, I would be leaving out once again for my second deployment with this ground combat unit. 1 month into the deployment, I received my Dear John letter via video, and was a picture of my second wife holding my son and her new boyfriend holding my daughter. And once again, the power of attorney would come to play. Now, it would be the events of this marriage that would help me, put me on the path to a real relationship with God. Now, this divorce would really wreck me mentally. I really felt betrayed, even more so than I did with my second marriage. Even more so than I did with my first marriage. Sorry about that. Because this time, I was the one at fault. So, after several weeks of receiving emails and trying to talk to my ex-wife and having her boyfriend text me back or email me back, I'm sitting in my little can. That's what we used to call these things we lived in Iraq. About as big as your standard bathroom. I have a room full of ammo. I have all this, I'm just thinking, I'm done. My accounts now have been drained. That's after a 12-year, I think, military career. All my accounts are drained. They are packed up and left and gone somewhere else. And my house is now in foreclosure. My cars are repossessed, all but one. The only thing I have with me, basically, is what I have in Iraq. So, I do something that I've never done before. Next to my can, probably about 40 yards away, was a very small chapel. It was about 10 o'clock at night. I would walk over to this chapel, and for the very first time in my life, I think I would actually sit down and have a heartfelt prayer directed to God. I don't remember what the prayer was about, don't remember the conversation at all. All I remember is there was nobody in the chapel but me. There was one candle burning off in the corner. And the next thing I know from all of the prayers, that I entered into this chapel at 10 o'clock at night. The next thing I remember being conscious about, is Reveille is going out. So that means it was about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. And I spent from 10 p.m. until this time in this chapel praying. When I walked out of this chapel, I had a profound sense of peace about me. Something I couldn't possibly understand. And for the rest of this deployment, it was I was strangely content, strangely at ease. Almost as if I knew nothing was going to happen to me. It was just a great deployment. A great deployment despite all the events that would take place over the next 8 months. So now the difficult part of my life would begin. As we are packing up and getting ready to go home, I'm desperately trying to contact my wife at the time to reconcile this marriage, or at least, be on the base with so I can see my kids, who I haven't seen now at this point in time in about 9 months. and I never, ever, ever could get her to comply, which I completely understand now. So as we're packing up, we load on these airplanes. I would say at least probably about 500 to 600 Marines. Everybody's excited, everybody's happy, and I'm knowing that I have nothing to look forward to. But this has become the norm for me, actually, because it's the same thing that happened when I came home off my Mediterranean deployment several years before. The plane lands at March Air Force Base. We take showers, put on clean uniforms, and we go from the airport, from the Air Force Base airport onto several transport buses, and we bus for the next hour down to Camp Pendleton. There, we stop off at the mobile armory, turn in our weapons, get one last safety briefing, and we get on these buses to head to Camp Pendleton. Now, I can remember sitting on this bus, looking out the window. You can feel the moment, you know, the happiness, the joy, and everything else with it. And I'm thinking, oh my God, it would be very, very nice if my ex was there, or at least had my kids there. I remember pulling up to this base, and you can see it was just a sea of people. Signs everywhere. Everybody's happy. Everybody's celebrating. Everybody's just in these great moods. And I'm thinking, oh, I remember looking out over this at this point in time. I'm about 38, 39, thinking what a disaster this is about to be. We pulled up. I'm looking out the window. All these smiling faces, all these signs. Children are crying. Wives are crying. Husbands are crying. I purposely sat in my seat till everybody got off. Now, off in the distance, towards my command post, there was this lieutenant there. He was assigned to make sure I got checked into the barracks. I carry all of my gear over towards him, and he gives me a key to the barracks. Now imagine that. I'm 38 or 39, I forgot how old I was. I have been in the military now about 14 years. I had a house, I had 3 cars, I had a very materialistic lifestyle. I had a very narcissistic lifestyle. And now all of that had been reduced to whatever I had in my bags from combat, which means I had 3 pair of basketball shorts, 5 t-shirts, 1 pair of tennis shoes, 2 pair of flip-flops, and about $300 in my pocket, because my soon-to-be ex had cleared out all the accounts. She had obtained loans, she got them credit cards. So basically I went from having money in the bank to about $40,000 in debt. Had all these great name brand clothes. I had Jordans. I had snakeskin boots. I had all this great, just all a bunch of materialistic stuff. And now here I am, reduced down to flip-flops, basketball shorts, tennis shoes, living in the barracks with 18-year-olds. I remember that day, laying in this twin bed. I used to have a king-size bed, actually. Actually, the funny thing is I had just brought this bed 3 weeks before deploying. So I brought this bed for my soon-to-be ex-wife and her new boyfriend. So now I'm sleeping in a twin-size bed. And I remember thinking, man, things were so much more enjoyable back in Iraq. So my heart is being drawn and torn, and it's been led to go to, I need to be at church. Now, before I had left, I'm going to go back again. Like I said, this is just me doing this off the top of my head, trying to remember all the events, trying to be obedient. Well, the Sunday before we left for deployment, me and my wife and children went to church. Now, we went to a big church-going family. In fact, I hadn't been to church on a regular basis since I left my home in 1990. And now we're looking at 2007 or 8. Or maybe even 9. But anyway, I remember overwhelmingly hearing God at this service. The pastor was up on the stage preaching. We were at this mega church in San Diego. And God told me, Chris, this is what I need you to be doing. I remember looking over at my wife and telling her, I think God wants me to be doing what he's doing. And I remember her looking at me and said, quit being silly, Chris. You're going to be a doctor. Because you see, me and her had already made plans. I was going to go to med school. I'm not sure what her plans were going to be. I forgot what they were. But anyway, we had already decided where we wanted to live at. We had already decided what kind of cars we wanted to drive. We wanted to continue on in a very, very materialistic lifestyle. I can remember on the drive home from that service, actually crying to myself while I'm looking out of the window, because actually, even though I was not in a relationship with God, I could absolutely feel that abandonment. So, on that Tuesday, which was, 3 days, it was on Wednesday. It was on that Wednesday later, I'm in the parking lot with my wife and children. This would be the last time I would see them. And I depart for this combat tour. Ironically, upon returning home from this tour, everything that I had spent years of my life putting before God, he took away. He took away the cars. He took away the house. He took away the clothes. He took away the money. And he would even take away my wife and children. So I remember going back to this church. The church wasn't open. I remember just sitting on the steps, learning to pray, holding my Bible. And this would began parlay, I guess you can say, into a relationship with God. Here I am, a very much so broken man. And I remember one day praying while in the barracks, and God gave me this revelation in which he told me, you need to pray for the man that your wife is in this relationship with. Imagine that, if you will, that your heart, something that's been put on your heart is to pray for the man who is holding your daughter, who is responsible for the fall apart of your relationship. For the first few days, I was disobedient. I didn't want to do it. And then I started giving just these unheartfelt prayers. And eventually, I started learning to pray for this man. Eventually, I started to pray for him wholeheartedly, as if I was praying for myself, because I completely got it now. Here was a man who, if he passed away while still in a relationship with my wife, he had no interest into entry into heaven. He was a man pretty much like myself. So it was once I started to pray for this man whole from my heart, my life would also begin to take another change. I began to feel myself drawing closer and closer to God. So I entered into this program for anger issues. And it was in this program I would meet a guy who would guide me into my relationship with God, a man named Johnny Ray Martinez. Me and Johnny Ray would develop a great friendship. Johnny Ray would help counsel me and push me towards a proper relationship with God. I would start going to church, and this began about a 3-year journey. Over the next 3 years, I was at church on a regular basis. Pretty much any time the doors were open, I had weekly ministries with Johnny Ray. Also was in his presence. Me and Johnny Ray hung out quite a bit. But my military career was taking its hits, because my soon-to-be ex-wife was becoming a thorn in my side of my career, actually. But it was just God's plan. I remember one day hearing God tell me, Chris, you done spent 20 years held in the physical body. I now need you to start preparing to heal the spirits. Now, for the first time in my life, I would walk out of a relationship. I wouldn't have any kind of relationship. My relationship was with God. I wasn't searching, because now I'm getting ready to go on my second divorce. I have 4 kids in which I don't have a very strong relationship with. So I began to recognize that I was an obvious failure. So during these 3 years, I began to set aside all those devices of mine. I quit drinking. I just ended all my relationships. I began to read the Word of God. I began to study His Word. Even my music choices changed. What I watched on TV changed. This was just a complete lifestyle change. I learned to began to live for the day and understanding that God had provided all the provisions I needed for that day and being content with that. I remember spending most of my day kind of like this, sitting by the beach and just praying and meditating. And God would always, He was just revealing things to me during this time. Now, like I had mentioned earlier, I was always at this church I was at in San Diego. Anytime the doors are open. So, when you go to church on a regular basis over the period of 3 years, you're going to have a few people that you see on a regular basis. And it was this young lady there. I know you're pretty much saying, oh God, here we go again. But there was this young lady there. And I probably had spoken to this young lady over the time of maybe the past year or two. Not really ever putting any stock into the conversation. She was always at the front of the line. It was, like I said, it was a mega church, so people actually get in line an hour before church service started. And it was funny because when the doors opened, they would all bolt, running as fast as they possibly could so they could get to the front rows. And this particular young lady was one of those people. Every time I would get there, she would already be there. And as soon as the doors opened, she would run as fast as she possibly could in order to be able to sit on the front row. I remember we would laugh at her some days, but here I am. I would do the same thing, but I wasn't interested in sitting in the front row. I sat about three to four rows back. I had a Pacific seat at a Pacific location in which I would sit at. Now, this young lady, whose name is Kelly, she was very big into the homeless ministry, as I would find out later. So one day, me and my dear friend Johnny Ray, we were out doing ministry with with a group of guys with anger issues, and me and him just got into a conversation talking about how Jesus would have ministered in an environment of church without walls, which so coincidentally happened to be the name of the homeless ministry that this young lady was a part of. Well, good old Johnny Ray and I would venture off to one of the local San Diego parks where this homeless ministry of Church Without Walls was taking place. And lo and behold, for the first time, this is where I saw her. It's at Church Without Walls is the first time I would see Kelly outside of the church building itself on Sunday services. Now, during this time, I'm also joined this group called Iron Man, thanks to a guy named Sanford Nichols. And Iron Man was a 1-year-long discipleship training, just learning Bible scriptures, reading commentaries, studying the Word of God. And this was another eye-opening event in my life, something I would have never done in the past. So right now I have two awesome individuals in my life who will lead me down the right path. Good old Johnny Ray Martinez and Sanford Nichols. One particular day, so at this point in my life, I'm still very much a broken man. Most of my money is going over to my soon-to-be ex-wife, who I'm separated from at the time. I'm still living in the barracks, but I have been blessed to have one vehicle. And unfortunately, it's probably the worst vehicle you can have when you don't have any money. It was a car that I brought that I managed to get back before it got returned back to the car lot. And think I'm what do you call it? Well, thinking back, I should have just let it go back. But I did not, because I remember I brought this car and I love this car very much. It was a Mercedes-Benz E350. It was black. It was a beautiful car. It was an intent. Let's see, I'm babbling. This is why I hate being on camera. But like I said, this is what I've been called to do. So those of y'all who are watching this, forgive me. Well, anyway, it was this attention-getting car. Now, even though I was on this new path of walking with God, I held this car in high regards. I would park it in special parking spaces. You know, it was a Mercedes-Benz afterwards. It was a Mercedes-Benz. So I would take this. I was just ridiculous. This car was actually going to be a vice that was going to, if I would have allowed it, it was going to pull me away from God. I couldn't afford really to gas it. I couldn't afford to get it oil changed. I couldn't afford to do much with this car other than drive it. So technically, I couldn't even afford to drive it if I couldn't afford to take care of it. Being somewhat in a position in which I could hear God speaking to me now, I remember hearing God telling me, Chris, get rid of this car. I'm sure if I would have been obedient, that he would have given me something that I could afford. But I tried to negotiate with God. I tell him, I would say, God, well, you know, I need this car to get back and forth to work. Technically, I didn't, because I lived in the barracks, and the place where I worked at now was less than a 5-minute walk from my barracks room. But I think God was honoring the fact that I was in church, which was in San Diego, which was about a 45-minute drive away from where I worked at. So he allowed me to keep this car for a short period of time. Well, finally my military career was coming to an end. And I had now, after 3 years, had entered into a relationship with this young lady, Kelly. Now, our relationship was kind of funny because I remember praying to God that if he ever wanted me in another relationship, it was going to be somebody he had to bring me. I wasn't going to look, because the only relationship that I wanted was with him. So, me and Kelly happened to start dating from a mistake, I guess you could say. While we were at this park and she was doing her homeless ministry, she recognized me from seeing me every Sunday, standing in the front of the line with her. And I was on one side of the park, she was on the other side of the park. She called me over. I walk over thinking, man, this girl must like me. I looked over at Johnny Ray and said, hey, Johnny Ray, I'm going to go talk to this girl real quick. I remember him laughing and smiling, giving me a hug, and said, well, I'm going to go home. I walked over to this park. Over to across the park. I'm babbling. I'm sorry. Sat down next to her and we started talking, and this conversation would lead into our relationship. Now, here's the mistake part. I was under the assumption that she was calling me over because she liked me, and she was just pretty much calling me over to talk to me about this homeless ministry. But we would exchange numbers, and we eventually started hanging out, and our relationship became serious. But being that she was a godly woman, and I had never been with a godly woman before, I was moving in this godly path. It was a non-sexual relationship, something that I had not had ever. Well, my military career would come to an end after 21 years, uneventfully. My second marriage would come to an end after 8 years. And now I'm on the cusp of being a man who walks with God. I have 2 great mentors in my life, and I have a godly girlfriend, I guess you can say. But we are both on the same mindset. So 9 months later, her and I would get married. something very funny about our marriage is this. As we were together, God tended to move us in the same direction at the same time, giving us the same way of thinking. So as we were at church, we began to feel ourselves being drawn away from Christianity. I remember sitting in church some days and she would be doing homework, sitting on the front row of this mega church, and neither one of us paying attention to the sermon, right? Now, at this point, I had joined while I was in Ironman. I remember one Wednesday night, this rabbi, Messianic rabbi named Rabbi Barney Katzman, came and gave a class. And the class was kind of an uneventful class. It was called the Jewish Life Cycle, and it was talking about, from birth to death of the Jew. I remember looking around this room, and it was about 300 guys in this room. Half of them were sleeping, the other half were playing on their phones, and here I am. I am completely wrapped up and engulfed in exactly everything this guy was saying. I remember trying to talk to him about it, wasn't able to really explain it. And I remember him giving me his card and telling me to come by his synagogue. Now the problem is, I'm with this woman who's been in church all her life. She is a dead set, she was doing everything at this church. So I wasn't sure of how this was going to play out. But I was more willing to be obedient to God than to be obedient to a relationship. So if it was God's will, then her heart would change, but I hadn't talked to her about it yet. So my last Sunday there, I looked over at Kelly. She was half slumped down in her chair, half asleep. I was slumped down in my chair, half asleep. I couldn't have even told you what the preacher was preaching about, nor could I have told you what he had preached about in months. And I remember getting up thinking, this is the last time I'm coming back here. I'm finally about to go over to this Messianic synagogue called Kehilat Ariel, next Shabbat or next Saturday, whether Kelly went or not. I remember telling Kelly about these plans, and the glory of God, she was overjoyed with this move. We go in because she is she's always been fascinated with Hebrew, the Hebrew language, because she was having confrontation within her spirit about, she always wanted to know what the Bible said originally, because there's always so much, when you go to a church service, it can differ from message to message. It's always conflict, I guess you can say, spiritual conflict. The message differs. There's the preacher can preach about stuff that's in conflict with the Bible, where anyway, I'll get into it later on. So she was big on studying the Bible in Hebrew. I was being drawn spiritually this way. So we ended up in our first service, and it was actually, we both felt like we were at home. Now, being that her and I met doing homeless ministry, and we continued to do homeless ministry until we left and went to Los Angeles. We got married 9 months after we met, and we got married at a park in San Diego called Kate Sessions. And it was kind of a different type of marriage. Johnny Ray would marry us, but 90% of our guests would be the homeless people that we had spent the past few months ministering to. On our wedding invitations, we asked to bring large print Bibles and socks, because this is mostly what the homeless people wanted. So we took all our wedding gifts. That's what we wanted for our wedding gifts. So we took all our wedding gifts and gave them to our homeless audience. We had everything about this wedding was free. Except for our clothes, but I wore a uniform. We had somebody from the church come in and did the cooking. Everything was given to us, and pretty much everybody had a great day. They celebrated, and the day after we would end up going on I think it was a 10-day cruise. And when we came back, it was, that's when our journey would begin. Soon after coming back, I would graduate from the Iron Man thing, and we would move on as a couple from church into a Messianic synagogue. From there, we would spend a few more months in San Diego, and then we would move up to Los Angeles. And that is another story for another